Good evening. So as Kay said, this talk will be videotaped, so I have a microphone for the videotape. I also have a microphone for the house, so I'm well aware of the fact that at some point I probably will be electrocuted. And by the way, the other two talks that I gave earlier in the university on the Middle East, Arab Spring and Middle East politics, those were also videotaped, and they will be available at some point on the university website as well. So those are the only two talks that I believe right now are being videotaped, but I hope you'll find them helpful. But tonight, I'm talking about the Vatican Synod on the Family. This is really an unbelievably remarkable event that's happening in our church right now. First of all, let me just describe what a synod is. A synod is a fancy Greek word that means talk together. And it usually is a word that the church uses whenever they call a meeting of people around the world to come to the Vatican to talk together on some important topic. And in October of last year, of 2014, Pope Francis invited about 150 cardinals, bishops, scholars, and lay people to come to the Vatican to begin a synod, a conference on marriage and the family. All right? And the purpose of that October meeting was simply to surface the questions. What is the topic that we want to address? Then there was going to be a year-long, church-wide discussion about these issues, leading up to this coming October in 2015, when 250 cardinals, bishops, scholars, lay people will assemble in the Vatican for the purpose of assembling all of that year-long discussion and present proposals to the Pope. Now, in October of 2014 was the initial conference, that was the initial synod, to surface the topics. A month later, in November, there was a follow-on synod that I was able to attend. Now, I was able to attend for this reason. When I received my sabbatical year from Archbishop Gomez, one of our university professors, Carter Sneed, who you just heard being talked about, came here in the university a number of years ago, and he and I connected, and we stayed friends all these years. And when he heard about the sabbatical, he emailed me and he said, You're welcome to come to Notre Dame as a visiting research fellow for the year. And I said, what color is the ground? Is it white? Is there snow? Not going to happen. But I did go there, so I do have that status. I am a visiting research fellow at Notre Dame, and I was there for about 6 weeks in the fall, before that polar vortex came down. But as a consequence, I was able to meet at one of the conferences there Cardinal Mueller. Cardinal Mueller has a great title. He's the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. That is the number 2 position in the Vatican. He is basically in charge of Catholic theology. Obviously, the Pope is in charge, but he is the chief theologian. And he came to Notre Dame for a conference, and because I was a fellow, I got to go to a lot of private meetings with him, and it was really wonderful to meet him. He speaks fairly good English, and it was just great to meet him. So I got some inside information about all these things that I'll share with you tonight. In November, Notre Dame and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Mueller, sponsored a synod in the Vatican as a follow-up to this synod on the marriage and the family. Now remember, the October synod was Catholic bishops, cardinals, scholars, and lay people. The November synod was ecumenical. It was an interreligious and international event. So there were Hindus, Buddhists, Mormons, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims. Rick Warren, the famous Protestant pastor, was there. Rabbi Sachs, the chief rabbi of the entire British Commonwealth, was there. Really was a fascinating experience, and I do have one picture of it from here. I'll just have it, you can't see it right now, but this is because the Pope launched it off. He actually came to the opening session. Here's the Pope right here, and unfortunately, I'm right here looking at my cell phone. This is the California section. But I was sitting in the Notre Dame section. It was really an unbelievably beautiful experience to be. So the Synod began with a Catholic experience in October and then moved right into November as a interreligious. What do all the other religions have to say about marriage and family, right? Very important. So the whole process wants to be very inclusive, wants to get as much information as they can from everybody, not only from our own Catholic heritage and tradition, but also let's see what Buddhists and Hindus and everybody else has to say. By the way, can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. So that was the experience. That's what's happened so far. Now, all of this happened because of Pope Francis. He really is a most remarkable person. But how this began actually started before Pope Francis. And how Pope Francis began, we have to go back to 2005 when Pope John Paul passed away. And now there is the conclave to elect a new successor after Pope John Paul II. Obviously, John Paul II was a larger-than-life figure, traveled the world stage. You know, more people in the world have seen this one human being than any other human being in the history of the world, right? When he went to Ireland, 3 million people came to Mass in Ireland. The island of Ireland actually tipped. The largest assembly of human beings in world history occurred in the Philippines when Pope John Paul came there, and in Korea and a number of places. He came here to Los Angeles. So he really was this titanic large figure. Here's the problem. Pope John Paul, had 2 missions. One is to travel the world, and the second was to defeat communism. Check, check. Mission accomplished, he did both, okay? But the problem is, he was largely gone from the Vatican. And so when the cardinals are flying into Rome to elect his successor, they had a rising concern about 2 things. One was, there was a great concern that the Vatican bureaucracy was getting out of touch with you and me, and that they were becoming very bureaucratic, very filled with themselves, and very unhelpful. And there was actually almost 100% universal agreement amongst all church leaders that the Vatican bureaucracy was just not well led because Pope John Paul was largely gone a lot. I'm glad he was gone. He was doing good things. But while he was away, the Vatican bureaucracy got fat and sclerotic. Okay. The second thing is, in the kind of the rising secular culture, a lot of the cardinals felt that marriage and the family was under attack. That many people who were getting married with great heart, with great desire and great hope for the future, after 5 or 6 years, they hated each other and were getting a divorce, and then getting multiple marriages. Children were in step families, and so there was just this great concern amongst the cardinals and bishops that marriage and family needed resuscitation, needed emergency first aid. So they were flying into Rome for these 2 agendas, that the next pope really has to address Vatican bureaucracy and marriage and the family. However, something happened as they flew into Rome that no one ever expected, that startled them, shocked people, and amazingly shocked me. When Pope John Paul died, It's very customary that, for any head of state, they put the body in a place where people can walk by. They lie in state. I think that's the phrase. And then people can walk by to pay their respects. So they put the body of John Paul II in the Vatican, and people lined up to walk by. And you couldn't stop, you just had to keep on walking. But you could walk by. Now the line went out of the Vatican, and it got bigger and bigger. And it went out to the end of the Via Conciliazione there, to the Tiber River. And then it kind of curved around. And long story short, it went to the city limits of Rome. And the city of Rome estimated that between 4 and 5 million people walked by John Paul when his body was in state. That line went all the way to the city limits of Rome. When you got to the end of the line, you were told that your wait was 26 hours. When you go to Disneyland and the line says 45 minutes and you get really irritated? 26 hours. Now, what kind of person can stand in line for 26 hours? Not very many. Young people. And young people from all over Europe and the world flocked to Rome. It was a phenomena. It was just a magic moment that nobody predicted. But people from all over the place, put their backpacks on, got on a train, went to Rome, and got in line for a 26-hour wait. All of the churches in Rome basically shut down and serviced the line, hearing confessions, talking to people, celebrating Mass by the line. The city of Rome basically oriented all of their civic services, food, water, restrooms, and everything, to service this massive serpentine line of 5 million people coming in to see Pope John Paul II. So the cardinals see this, and they're startled. And they say, we are flying in, and we have a couple of frontline people that we're thinking are going to be Pope, and they're from South America, like Bergoglio from Argentina. He wasn't the number one guy, but he was certainly in the top, maybe the top 5. And they said, look at this. This is a phenomenon that we cannot believe. And by the way, if you remember that time, for 3 days, ABC, NBC, CBS, and cable news had 72 hours straight coverage of the funeral of John Paul II. There was no other shows going on except what was happening in Rome. So 5 million people, and everyone who was watching TV was watching this funeral. And all of the funeral all the funeral events were hosted by Cardinal Ratzinger. So the cardinal said, there's this huge attention on John Paul II. We cannot bring in a brand new person that no one's ever heard of from South America right now. So instead, we're going to elect someone who is the closest associate of John Paul II and make him the Pope. That was him. That was Cardinal Ratzinger, yeah. Right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's what happened. It was kind of at the last minute they changed their mind, because they didn't want to have such a huge shift from John Paul II, because they saw this huge outswell of emotion for him. So Cardinal Ratzinger was elected Pope. Cardinal Ratzinger has 2 qualities. He probably is the highest IQ Pope we have ever had, by far and away. He's the most intelligent, highest IQ Pope we've ever had. He is also, by far and away, the most polite, gentle, etiquette Pope we've ever had. He's just a very, very gentle man. However, he had that position in the Vatican for 21 years. If you're in the Vatican for 21 years, you have no credibility for reforming the Vatican, right? And he knew that. And he actually didn't want to be Pope, but he accepted the position. And he took it for about 5 or 6 or 7 years. And for whatever reason, his own personal reasons, whatever was going on, people speculate, he decided to retire. Very remarkable decision. Now, I'm just going to tell you my personal opinion, since you're insisting on it. I think he knew all this, and he said, you elected me Pope, I'll do it for a number of years. I am completely incapable of reforming the Vatican. I don't have the credibility to really, I'm a scholar, I'm a librarian. I can't really speak about marriage and the family. So I'm going to retire, and now you guys can vote for the person you wanted in the first place. Now, how generous is that? How generous, how loving, how kind, how polite is that? He steps aside. The next council comes in, and fairly quickly, I think in the third ballot, fairly quickly, the vote settled on Bergoglio from Argentina. And Bergoglio has talked about this frequently, that at the moment when it looked like all the votes were coming his way, and everyone would recognize that it was happening to him, the cardinal next to him leaned over to Bergoglio and said, I think almost at the moment that the election was announced, like, you're the guy. And this cardinal leaned over next to him and said, remember the poor. Beautiful line. The poor. Remember the poor. Now, it's interesting because that is a completely superfluous message. No one needed to remind Bergoglio about the poor. He had spent a lifetime in Argentina being in the forefront of a man of the poor. He was famous for riding the subways, lived very simply. He was just a guy who was out in the slums all the time. So what happened, then a very remarkable thing happened. When you're named Pope, they announce your name. You won the election. Then the guy, the maitre d' or the MC or whoever's running this thing, walks up to the candidate and says, you won, and he asks 2 questions. No, hey. I work alone here, okay? Just kidding. He walks up to the candidate and he asks 2 questions. One is, do you accept? That's a very powerful thing. Do you accept? You know where that comes from? That comes from the Annunciation. When the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Would you like to be the mother of our Lord? Do you accept? And Mary said, excuse me, I have a question first. Which is beautiful. And, the angel says, fire away. We can't go forward unless you freely accept. And so they have this dialogue back and forth, and finally Mary says yes, and so Christmas happens. But again, God can't do anything unless he can't force himself on us unless we agree and accept. So they come up to the candidate and say, do you accept? And Bergoglio said yes. And then the next question is, what name do you take? Now this is really powerful. He takes the name Francis. That is an earthquake in papal history. St. Francis died 800 years ago. No one has ever taken that name. We have 23 Johns, right? John the 23rd. We have 12 Piuses. We have 16 Benedicts. No one has ever taken the name Francis. It's too big. It's too iconic. It's just too massive a name. It's like no pope ever takes the name Jesus or even Joseph. And no one took the name Francis. It was too big. But when he took the name Francis, not a ripple, because everyone said, they looked at his life and said, oh, your life? Yeah, your life actually matches Francis. And so he takes this name that everyone was always afraid to take before, and he takes the name Francis, and everything is cool. Really is remarkable. So, and when he stands on that balcony on the night of the election, he does that remarkable thing. If you remember this, remember he says, he's talking to this 300,000 people in the audience in the square, and he says, let me ask for your blessing. And he goes like this. Remember that? Okay, he actually did that a lot in Argentina. He did that quite a bit in Argentina, so that was familiar to him. It was brand new for everybody else, but that was part of that Francis style that he has. So he really kind of remarkably made a very, very positive impact from the very beginning. Now, who's covering this is the world's media, the world's press. Now, I have to tell you something now. It may be counterintuitive. You may like it, you may not, but I just have to tell you something that's a little shocking. But I have to tell you that most of the press is not religious. I needed to break that to you right now. Shatter that illusion. But most of the press is not religious. And they don't understand religious categories. They don't understand religious impulses. It's actually very difficult for people in the press to understand anyone doing anything for religious purposes. Now, I mentioned earlier that I gave these 2 talks on the Middle East. One of the reasons why the press has a hard time writing on issues in the Middle East is because they have a very difficult time understanding religious motivation. Everything happening in the Middle East right now is not political. Everything happening in the Middle East right now is religious. Shia versus Sunni, etc., beheading Christians, all this kind of stuff. And the press, it just goes in one ear and out the other. They don't understand it, they have a hard time grasping it, and it's very confusing to them. So here they are now kind of enamored of this religious person, Pope Francis. Now, what does the press do a lot? They cover politics. Democrats, Republicans, right? So that's what they do 7 days a week. They cover politics. And what they understand is these 2 groups, Republicans and Democrats, are institutions that have platforms, that have principles, they have things that they believe in that often change. So Republicans, remember President Bush the first, no new taxes, read my lips, no new taxes, and then he raised taxes, right? And Democrats will have a position and then they'll change. So the press has no understanding of any institution that has enduring beliefs. The idea that these are beliefs that are always true. They tend to look at every institution as simply pragmatic. They're holding these beliefs right now, but of course they'll change. That's the way they look at the Catholic Church. They cannot understand that any Catholic would actually have religious motivations. The Catholic Church is simply an institution, like Republicans and Democrats, that has beliefs right now, but of course they can change. Does that make sense? Now, what absolutely fed that narrative, that's called a narrative, by the way. It's a way of understanding an institution. A narrative is this institution has beliefs, but they will change. That whole narrative changed on an airplane. I can't remember where he was going, but Pope Francis was going from someplace to someplace, and on the plane was John Allen. John Allen is the senior CNN Vatican correspondent. He's also with the Boston Globe, and he will be at St. Julie's Church on March 16th in the university. He comes to the university every year. Coming back from Argentina. Okay. So John Allen, who if you want, I would recommend that you go see him March 16th at St. Julie's. He was the one who actually asked the Pope a question on the plane at the press conference about people with same-sex attraction. He didn't ask about same-sex marriage. He asked about same-sex attraction. And Pope Francis said, if someone is following their conscience and doing everything they can and being as sincere and honest as they can, and he used this magic phrase, who am I to judge? Let's all say it together. Who am I to judge? That phrase, I mean, you can have there was before that phrase and after that phrase, because that was an earthquake in media relations with the Pope. They went nuts. This is the greatest Pope ever. They love this because what was the narrative? Catholic Church is an institution, like Republicans and Democrats, has positions that can change. Here is the new president of the Catholic Church, and he's going to change Catholic things. So that's the narrative. Here is this wonderful new Pope who rode the subways in Argentina, wonderful guy. He's going to change everything. We've got to pump this Pope. All right. So really, he just automatically. Now, I'm 36 years in this business. Right. 36 years I've been ordained. I have never in my life seen such adoration from the press for anything in the Catholic Church, right? Now, the press, besides having this narrative of institutions that have policies that change, the press is also an institution that has two fundamental beliefs that they preserve, protect, and defend. And one is unlimited access to abortion and same-sex marriage. These are shibboleths of the press. These are values that the press massively upholds. Any institution that's against it, they fight. Any institution that's for it, they support. So here is this Catholic Church, which for years and years, according to the press, has been very much against unlimited access to abortion and same-sex marriage. Now we have the president of the Catholic Church who seems to be saying something different. So the new narrative is the wonderful Pope and those evil cardinals that are getting in the way. Now, as they mentioned in the beginning, I went to USC to get this degree in psychology, and there is a dynamic in psychology, it's very famous, it's called the halo effect, of all things. The halo effect. The halo effect means that if you like someone and you're missing some information about them, let's say that you really like, what's your name? Linda. So let's say I really like Linda, and we had agreed to meet at 3 o'clock. And I think Linda is one of the greatest people in the world, and she's late. And I would say, where's Linda? You know what? She's probably feeding the poor. She's probably visiting the sick. She's doing something wonderful, right? Because I like Linda, so even though I don't know why she's missing, I'm going to fill in the blanks with positive information. Let's say I don't like Linda. Linda's late. Drunk again. I'm kidding. Right? So you fill in the blanks with information. It's a very, very common dynamic. So one of the famous things that happened about Pope Francis is, and the reason I'm going on and on about this person is because it is this person who is setting the dynamic of this whole synod on the marriage and the family. But very famously, the popes live, if you've ever been to the Vatican, if you're looking at the St. Peter's Square, to the right is a large 6-story building. That's called the Apostolic Palace, and the top floor is the papal apartments. And I've been there. I was very lucky to be there about 20 years ago with my dad, of all things. And we had Mass with Pope John Paul II and got to see it and all. And I have to tell you that it's not very luxurious. It's fairly austere. In fact, I would consider it to be uncomfortable. But it's in the Apostolic Palace, and so the press conceives of that as some Renaissance palace, right? Now, about 15 years ago, the Vatican built a large hotel. If you're looking at St. Peter's, to the right is the Apostolic Palace. To the left is behind the gate, behind the columns, is a brand new hotel called the Santa Marta Hotel. And they built that, it's about 115 rooms, and they built that for guests of the Vatican, and that's where all of the cardinals stay during the conclave. When they're voting for the Pope, they stay there. So when Bergoglio came from Argentina to vote in the conclave in which he became Pope, he stayed in the Santa Marta Hotel. It's like a 3-story building, and again, very simple. But prior to Bergoglio becoming Pope, the narrative that the press had was very anti-Catholic, very anti-church. So they used to refer to the Apostolic Palace and to the Santa Marta Hotel. They used to call the Santa Marta Hotel a 5-star luxury hotel. After Pope Francis decided to stay there, to not live in the Apostolic Palace. The reason he chose to not stay in the Apostolic Palace has nothing to do with luxury, because neither place is. The reason is to get to the Apostolic Palace, you take a little elevator up 6 floors to that level. So it's kind of like at the top of a funnel. And Pope Francis is very much an extrovert, and he wants to be around people. At the Santa Marta Hotel, there's a lot of people there, and they have a chapel with about 200 people attending Mass every day, mostly the workers. And that's where he wanted to be. He wanted to be saying Mass with a lot of people, where if he wanted to mix with people, he could just walk down 1 flight of stairs and he's out and about, as opposed to being up in this top penthouse. Interesting, the press. Prior to Pope Francis being elected, they called the St. Marta Hotel a 5-star luxury hotel. After Francis was elected, he was staying in humble lodgings. It's the same building, but now they call it humble lodgings. Now, Francis starts and he calls this Synod on the family, on marriage and the family. Now, the Catholic Church has had many, many synods on marriage and the family. They've all been fairly similar, describing what the ideal marriage is, what the ideal family is, and calling people to live to those ideals. In my 36 years of being a priest, I've heard all of them. I've given workshops myself on all these ideas. And Pope Francis added something new to the Synod on the Family that made it very, very different, very interesting, and the reason why we're having this talk tonight. Because he did something that was extremely significant to me personally as well. He said, we're going to talk about the ideals of marriage and the ideals of family, and we're going to praise and strengthen those who are doing well. But I remember that cardinal who told me to remember the poor, and I remember that idea of dealing with those who have not done well. So we're going to add a brand new set of characters that we want to talk about at the Synod on the Family and Marriage. Not only are we going to talk about those people who are faithfully married and doing well, but I want to make sure that we talk about those who are divorced, who started a marriage with the greatest of intent, and things went down, and things went south. And we want to talk about them. We want to talk about people who have remarried, who suddenly have found hope again. And now they're remarried, but because they had a prior marriage, they can't receive communion. And we want to talk about people who have same-sex attraction. So these are groups that have always been part of our faith, but have really never been part of a synod, have never been part of a concerted effort of the church to look at, to listen to, to listen to, to listen to, and to address. Does that make sense? This is revolutionary. It really is quite extraordinary. And it really is, it's really made all the difference. And he's, now, when I was at USC, one of the dynamics that we used to talk about was, if you want to understand someone, because I have somebody in front of me who's come for help, I'm counseling them. If I want to understand them, I have to find out what is their narrative. What's their narrative? How do they understand themselves? And so if you want to understand Francis, what's his narrative? And his narrative, which he said a number of times, is his image of the church. And this is really beautiful. His image of the church is a field hospital. It's not a hospital, it's a field hospital. It's a hospital that's out on the front lines, where people are wounded and suffering and in difficult situations. And we want that church to be right there on the field so that when someone is hurt, there is aid and resources for exactly what that person's needs right there in front of them. I think that is a spectacular image. I mean, it's very important to have an image. And once you have that image, that kind of guides all the decisions that you make afterwards. Does that make sense? He, on New Year's, I think it was New Year's Day or something, somewhere around there in the beginning of January, he called all of the Vatican bureaucracy to a meeting. This was what was called a come to Jesus meeting. You would not want to be at that meeting. And he really dressed them down. And he basically said, I don't care about the color of the clothes that you're wearing, the number of medals that you have, the number of decorations that you have, or the titles that you have. We are a field hospital. And so you have to get out and start actually helping people. Really, it was phenomenal. And it got a lot of press in the church circles. So he's carrying this through. So the whole idea of a field hospital is just really just a profoundly moving and I think extremely important image of doing that. Now, this is an example of what he's talking about. And this is why it meant so much to me. I'm 36 years in parish life. So I deal with families and marriages and people all the time. And rarely do I get this phone call where someone calls me up and says, Father Dave, this is the Smiths. Just want to let you know that everything is going well. We're doing great. I don't get that. Who calls me? Help. We are suffering. This family is breaking up. This relationship is going down. My wife hates me. My husband hates me. My kids hate me. All this kind of stuff. And so I got to do something about that. And one of the most difficult is, let's say you have a guy who he's 18. Maybe he's going off to Vietnam. And before he goes off to Vietnam, he kind of impulsively gets married, right? And then he goes off to Vietnam, and when he comes back, the wife has gone to somebody else. And it could be reversed. It could be the wife who left, the guy who left, or whatever. And it was a 18-year-old situation. It was the kind of situations that 18-year-olds get into, all right? Lesson learned. What was I thinking? A few years later, this guy, this girl, they meet someone else. This is the person I should have married in the first place. They get married, and they have a perfectly faithful, wonderful marriage for 25, 30 years. Number of kids in the Catholic school, the kind of family that I would like to have my entire parish filled with a family like this. But here's the problem. They can't go to communion because he was in a prior marriage. So here's a guy that's his second marriage is exactly what the church likes. It's exactly fulfilling everything that the church hopes that marriage is, but because of this stupid 18-year-old thing that happened, they can't go to communion. And maybe because of a variety of circumstances, the annulment process can't really address that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the topics of the Synod are two topics. One, affirming marriage and family, things that Catholics have held from the very beginning. And number two, identifying the walking wounded, the people who have been hurt and has had a hard time with all these problems, and to make sure that they are addressed. Because for too long we've simply talked about what's good, but we haven't addressed the people who have fallen short. There's two really beautiful Gospels that surfaced a lot in all of the Synod discussions. One is the story of the Prodigal Son. You remember that story? Very famous story. This is a story of a relationship between a father and a son that went bad, that didn't go well. But the reaction of the father is interesting. Even though this child did everything wrong, the father remains faithful and attentive to that child. And Pope Francis wants that to be the attitude of the Church. Even though some people have not done marriage well, even though some people have not lived a very good Catholic life, he wants us to be that father in that gospel that still reaches out to that prodigal son, that prodigal marriage, that prodigal situation, and bring them back. In other words, the love of the Father never changes. The love of the Church can never change either. Does that make sense? I think it's a great idea. The other one is the woman caught in adultery. These are the two Gospels that just come in a lot. And the woman caught in adultery, she was guilty of what she did, just like the son in the prodigal son story was bad. The woman caught in adultery did something wrong. Jesus acknowledges that what she did was wrong, but he changes the punishment. The punishment that the crowd wanted was death. What Jesus says is, what you did is wrong, but I'm changing the punishment. I'm changing the sentence. The sentence is not going to be death. The sentence is simply going to be a changed life. He says, go and sin no more. So these two Gospels are kind of guiding the Synod. Now, why is marriage important? The marriage is not just one of the things that we have in our Catholic faith. It actually is our Catholic faith. And that's something that is coming out in the Synod dialogue. And it's something new that it's important for all Catholics to understand. Marriage is not something that Catholics do. It actually is our Catholic faith. And that's why we're making such a big thing of it. No one makes bigger deal about marriage than Catholics. No one makes a bigger deal about marriage than Catholics, because it actually is our faith. The Bible begins with a marriage, Adam and Eve. Was anybody here at the Adam and Eve talk that I gave a little while ago? Okay, I'll just repeat one little line from that. If you understand the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis, you can actually stop reading the Bible at that point. There's no need to read anymore. Everything in our Catholic faith actually is contained in the story of Adam and Eve. You don't even have to read the New Testament. You can ignore all four Gospels and the epistles. If you understand Genesis, you understand everything. And the Bible begins with a marriage, and it ends with the wedding reception of the Lamb in the book of Revelation. And the first miracle that Jesus does is the miracle at Cana, at a wedding. Okay. Now, why is this our Catholic faith? Because the entire Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, is about the relationship between people and God, right? And the image that they use for that relationship is marriage. Jesus, or God in the Old Testament, Jesus in the New Testament is the groom, and the people are the bride. That's the main image of the entire Bible, is a marriage. You can understand everything in our faith by relating it to marriage, even priesthood. The reason I don't get married, the reason I am a priest, the image of a priest is a husband. I'm writing a book on how to be a pastor. You would think, and I do write about management and leadership and how to run a meeting and priorities and strategy and all those kind of things. But the main qualities of a priest are not those managerial qualities that you might think of leading an organization. That's the Protestant world. The Protestant world has, those are institutional leaders that have managerial expertise. In the Catholic world, a priest stands in for Jesus, and Jesus is the husband. So how I understand myself as a priest is the qualities of a husband, not necessarily the qualities of an organizational managerial leader. Does that make sense? Read my book. So everything about our faith revolves around this idea of marriage. The second thing I'll say is all of our faith, what I've just told you is from Revelation. That's from, obviously, Adam and Eve is in the book of Genesis. Cana is in the Gospels. These are all biblical references. But the Catholic Church has actually two sources of our faith. And Revelation, or what God has said, either in tradition or scriptures, is only one. That's only one. And it's not the only source of our faith. The other source of our faith, believe it or not, is science, or what we call observation. And both are equal. One does not take precedence over the other. That sounds counterintuitive. It sounds kind of exotic. But the Bible and Revelation and science and observation are equal pillars of our faith. Now, how this applies to marriage would be something along these lines. What do we observe? So forget religion, forget Catholicism, forget the Bible. Just from a secular viewpoint, what do you observe about marriage? It pre-exists all of civilization. Civilization, human civilization, is my hobby. I'm a amateur archaeologist and paleontologist, and we can disagree on a couple of thousand years here, but I'm just going to be generous. Human civilization goes back about, at the farthest limit, about 10,000 years. Okay? Marriage goes back several million years. Now, in science, they don't call it marriage. They call it the very beautiful, romantic word, pair bonding. Now, just to bring you up to speed on the science, about certainly by 3, maybe even 4 million years ago, something happened that to this date, scientists do not know why it happened. Many different theories, but one of the things that happened in our human ancestors was they changed from walking on 4s to 2. They became bipedal. They walked on 2 legs. And they walked on 2 legs all day long. Other animals sometimes stand up for a little bit, but for some reason, our human ancestors stood up on 2 legs and they never changed, unless they were taking a nap. So we walked on 2 legs. Now nobody knows exactly why that happened. Different theories, and I explained it in my Adam and Eve talk, but one of the consequences of that is when a female person walks up on 2 legs, the consequences is that her skeleton changes. In order to be able to walk like this, your pelvis has to change. And paleontologists can look at a bone and instantly look at it and say right away whether this person walked on 2 or 4 legs because of the shape and the angle of the bone, because it has to be of a certain angle and shape in order to be able to walk like this. The consequence of that is the pelvis narrows, which means the birth canal narrows. And in order for a child to be born, the head gets very big, right? But in order for a child to be born, it has to be born before that head gets too big, or else it can't be born. So it's born premature. Human babies are born more premature than any other animal in existence. We are born helpless, and our children remain helpless until 25, 30. I mean, a horse gets born, and in 3 minutes it's running around, right? A child is born extraordinarily helpless. Now, in neo-Darwinian Darwin evolution, you have to understand, we have to figure out, why is that? I mean, why, if that's such a problem, there has to be something beneficial that you would have something that is so detrimental. Now, a mother then has this helpless blob on the ground, and after a while they begin to learn their lesson and saying, I have a helpless child. So what happens is let's say there's a girl watching this whole scene. When she grows up, she's going to say to herself, I don't want to end up like my mother. I'm going to pick a mate who will stick around and help me, because I don't want to have this helpless blob. I want to have someone, if I'm going to have somebody mate with me, I'm going to pick one who's going to be faithful, courageous, compassionate, and competent, right? Competent, meaning he'll go get food. Courageous, he'll protect me from the lions. Compassionate, will care. And faithful, will stick around. Because this kid may be 30 years old by the time they leave the cave. Does this make sense?
Yes.
This is what's called, in the science world, this is called female selection. In the human species, we have what's called female selection. It's the female who chooses who she mates with. It doesn't happen in other places in the animal world. Some places it does, but it's in the human species that we have female selection. So, many scientists believe that this pair bonding system is actually the cause of our evolutionary success. Because you have a helpless blob that's born, that can't do anything, completely helpless, but over that child is a mother who's faithful, courageous, competent, and compassionate. And that mother has, of all of the idiots in the tribe, and there were a few, picked one that, in her judgment, felt would be courageous, competent, compassionate, and faithful. And so what you have now is you have a mother and a father over a blob that over many, many years will protect this child. So what happens? What's the consequence of all this? The child survives. Now, as you know, in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, if a child grows up and is long enough to reproduce, right, then a lot of those characteristics will pass on to the next generation. So you have, and here's the other thing, not only does that child live long enough to reproduce, but it actually lives into old age. Because the care and compassion that the parents have for this kid continues. There are no old zebras, right? An old zebra on the African plain gets eaten, right? Nobody, if you have a herd of zebras running across the African plain, who's in the front? The teenagers, right? Who's in the back? Uncle Ernie. Uncle Ernie becomes lion lunch, right? And what do the other zebras do? When Uncle Ernie gets eaten, what do the other zebras think? Whew. Glad it wasn't me. Glad it wasn't me. That's why, to this day, zebras are still on the African plain. They haven't gone anywhere. They haven't progressed. But where are we? No zebra has ever gotten irritated because it missed its flight to New York. You know, they've remained zebras for millions of years. But humans have amazingly progressed because our children, because of compassionate, caring parents, have grown up to be old. And what do old people like to do? Teach the young people. Yes, Grandma. Right? So the knowledge that this old person has is now passed on to the child, and now you have the growth of human knowledge. Right? People often say, why are humans successful? Our bigger brains. Well, how did that happen? It happened because of parenting. Compassionate, caring, competent, and faithful parents. So you can either read Adam and Eve in Genesis, or you can read Charles Darwin, or the Neo-Darwin synthesis. But they come to the same conclusion. And the same conclusion is, what selected for our human success was marriage. It pre-existed civilization. Now, I'm talking something that occurred 3 million years ago. Civilization occurred 10,000 years ago. That's nothing. So what happened is, when societies began to form, marriage had been around for millennia. So they simply took it and codified it. They said, we need children, so we're going to regulate marriage. So that's how marriage happened. It was pre-existing. Nobody ever took it to be something that any human person designed or any human person thought up. It was already there, pre-existing. So now remember the two things, revelation and observation. The church, in looking at Revelation, says every single verse in the Bible that even mentions marriage refers to it as a man and a woman. Jesus specifically says that. The church then says, because of that, we don't have the authority to make a change, even if we wanted to. Even if we wanted to. Nobody wants to be unpopular. Nobody wants to be, attacked. But the church there's nothing the church can do, because the church doesn't have the authority to make that change. So can Pope Francis say, I do to same-sex marriage? He can't, because it doesn't have the authority. He doesn't have the authority to do so. If you're not Catholic, you can simply look at observation and come to the same conclusion. Now, I've given you, I had 150 of these handouts, so maybe not everybody got them, but I have 2 articles here. One is Same-Sex Couples in Marriage, which talks about 2 sources of our faith. And then I wrote another article later called A Non-Religious View of Same-Sex Couples in Marriage. So you can either, if you're not Catholic and you're here tonight, you can look at that, or if you know people who are not Catholic and could care less about the Bible, you can read that as well. So that's the that's kind of where the church is. From a revelation viewpoint, the church says we just don't have the authority, because every single verse in the Bible really refers it to this way. But if you're not Catholic or you're not religious, it turns out that the scientific analysis really does come to the same conclusion. Let me just end, and then we'll take some time for questions. Is this interesting? I'll just add one other thing. When I was at Notre Dame, Cardinal Mueller, the prefect for the Congregation of the Faith, came, and he came for a conference. And because I was a visiting fellow, I got to go to some of the cocktail receptions. And it was really one very interesting meeting. I don't know how I got there, but I was able to go to a meeting of just about 5 or 6 of us with Cardinal Mueller and the number 2 guy there at Notre Dame. Father Jenkins, the president of Notre Dame, was away. So the number 2 guy was there. So it was the cardinal, the local bishop, the number 2 guy at Notre Dame, and 2 other people and myself. And it was a very interesting thing, and it showed how Cardinal Mueller really understands American culture quite well. And we were talking about this issue of the Synod on the family, and he said, Notre Dame really has a unique position in American culture, whether you're Catholic or not. And I never told him that I went to SC, but but he said, in American culture, if a Catholic bishop says something and Notre Dame says something that's different, many people in America will consider the Notre Dame statement more authoritative than the bishop, because Notre Dame is so iconic. It's Notre Dame. And so he was making this case to Notre Dame and saying, we need to have Notre Dame really take the forefront and be champions of this idea of marriage and the family. And it was a beautiful statement, and I was thinking about it afterwards, and I was saying, I disagree. I didn't say that there, but I was just thinking afterwards, and I say, well, I don't really think it's up to Notre Dame or up to any bishop. I think it's really up to each of us, that we're the ones that have to make the case for marriage and the family, for it to be the strength and the source of not only of our evolutionary success, but our future success as a human species. Thank you. Now I'm going to give you a little dessert real quick. I'm going to give you, for those of you who are married, I'm going to give you 4 ideas to strengthen your marriage. All right? Is that okay? And it's just going to be a very simple mnemonic device. Just think of the word KISS. KISS, K-I-S-S. So the first idea, K-I-S-S. For a relationship to endure, you have a relationship you have to keep, okay? You have to keep in the same room. You can't text it in. You can't call in a relationship. Relationships are a iconically physical thing where you have to be in the physical presence of a person. Long-distance relationships are difficult and generally don't work. A relationship, you have to physically be in the same room. It's interesting that, there's a lot of talk today about social media and texting and all that kind of stuff. The Catholic Church is interesting in that it has this very primordial experience where the number one iconic thing that Catholics do is they physically come together at church on Sunday. You have to actually be in the room. You can't watch it on TV. You can't hear it on the radio. You have to physically be there. How primordial is that? So you have to really physically be together. So you have to keep in the same room. I stands for intimate, what I call intimate walk on a regular talk, or intimate talk on a regular walk, or the idea of staying engaged. When I marry people, I tell them you have different stages of their relationship. You became acquaintances, you became friends, you became lovers, you became engaged, and then you got married. After you're married, drop the title marriage and go back to being engaged. In the old English phrase of that, old English meaning of that, to be engaged, to be attuned, to be paying attention to the other person. I've done about 1,200 weddings in my life. 1,200 weddings. I know every one of them starts out wonderful. But what happens is they take each other for granted. They begin to take each other for granted. Oh, it's you again. I saw you yesterday. and you stop paying attention. What happens is, look, we're human beings. We continue to grow. And the way I was last year is not the way I am this year. And the things that I was interested in last year are not what I'm interested in this year. I'm a different person now than I was before. And if my partner is not paying attention, then we're going in different directions. And we don't even know it. We're managing the house. We're taking the kids to school. We're paying the bills. We're doing the business of marriage, but we're not paying attention. And what happens is 5 years later, when there's a problem and they want to talk to each other, they're strangers, right? Because they have gone in different directions. So staying engaged, staying intimate, and to do that on a regular basis. So keep in the same room, stay engaged. And S stands for, this is a little esoteric, but it means to speak meaningfully. Okay, and there's 3 types of conversation that we have for each other. We have factual information that we say. There was a lot of traffic on the freeway today, so I was late. Factual information. Now, there's factual information and emotional information, right? Now, stereotypically, women are very factual and men are very emotional, right? Did I get that wrong already? All right. Very stereotypical. Neither is helpful for a relationship. Each is unique stereotypically, but not helpful to a relationship. What is helpful to a relationship is meaningful talk. So factual talk would be, I was late for work because there was a lot of people on the freeway. Emotional talk would be, there were so many stupid people on the freeway today. Okay. Neither of those help. They happen, but they don't help. What's a meaningful talk? Meaningful talk would be, there was a lot of people on the freeway, and just as I was getting home, a car cut me off. And I almost got in an accident. Oh my God, I almost didn't make it home. Can you believe that? I almost didn't make it home. That meant our whole life could have been different, right? Now that's called meaningful talk. And the definition of meaning is when you take a small incident and you relate it to a larger context, relate it to a larger event. So the factual and the meaningful, the factual and the emotional both talked about traffic, but the meaningful related that traffic incident to our whole marriage. So anytime you take a small event and you relate it to a larger context, it's called giving meaning. Now, think about how you fell in love. When you fell in love, you were dating someone and you talked about facts, you talked about emotions, but what really made a difference was when the conversation turned meaningful. When you're dating, you talk about your job, facts, you talk about your irritated emotions, but then you talk about future plans. That's meaningful. And that's what people find satisfying. Does that make sense? So when you talk meaning, I'm not saying you do that all the time. We have facts and emotions, but the only conversation that actually draws people together is meaningful talk. So keep in the same room, stay engaged, speak meaningfully, and the last one is the best one of all. The last one is recognizing, which I deeply do, that you're going to forget everything I say. And that you may not buy the videotape. You're going to forget everything I say. And you know who else knew that? Jesus. Jesus knew that everything he said would be forgotten. So very cleverly, at the Last Supper, he came up with a plan and said, I'm going to give you something to do on a weekly basis They will tell you everything you need to know. And when you come to Mass, at the very center of Mass, you're going to hear the lesson of love that will keep you happy for the rest of your life. Because I'm going to take bread and wine, and I'm going to say, this is my body, and this is my blood, and my entire self is for you. And that's really what love is. I am taking my entire being, my competence, my compassion, my care, my faithfulness for this blob on the ground, and for my wife and my husband. I'm taking my entire being, and I'm offering it for your happiness. So on a weekly basis, you are reminded exactly what love is. So forget everything I said tonight. When you go to Mass on Sunday, every single Sunday, you get this reminder of really of how happiness can be found, and it's found in those words of the consecration, which comes from Jesus, who is the groom, and we are the bride in the marriage that is our faith. All right.